All right, I'm going to get started here. Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Curran, part of the SDLE Research Center as a material scientist. And today we're going to be doing an introduction to machine learning. My intent with this is to not go super heavy into the statistics of how some of these machine learning algorithms operate, but as a more general overview of what machine learning is, roughly how it works, and then some of the advantages we get from that. And then we're going to go into a few practical examples of how to use some different types of machine learning. So if we start out with just a basic what machine learning is, machine learning is a subset of AI that allows computers to learn as they move along. This is different where normally the thinking in this case, or learning, is done by a human, and then they dictate that to the computer, who then returns a model or something like that. But with machine learning, it's designed so that you can present the data to a machine and it can run through and optimize it as it iterates through. And then what you get out is a model that was developed by the machine with little to no input from a human. And so as these go through, they require optimization in order to reach this final model. So they end up starting out with very bad models, in most cases completely random ones, but then as they run through, they can tell when, by changing the parameters, how they can get closer to a better predictive accuracy from these. So some of the general advantages, the most important is that it's a very powerful inference tool, and that by moving or removing human learning from the process, we have the potential to discover patterns that we weren't looking for in the first place, or that we didn't think could be in there. So if a human has an idea of what or how something should be working, then they tell a computer to check for that, it might return something, but it's really not going to go much further than that from there. But if we leave all the learning to the computer, then we can get out results that we might not have expected before. And this is especially useful when we get into highly convoluted data that has a lot of dimensions to it, and we don't entirely know what we're looking for from that. But machine learning can handle that very well, where it becomes difficult for a human to have an idea of what to look for in something like that. This also goes very well with nonlinear relationships. They get very complicated as you start moving up with certain orders. And this is also working really well with the latest trends in computation and big data analytics. So computers are getting more and more powerful. Clusters of smaller ones are becoming easier to use and operate and cheaper to run. And then data collection is massively expanding. So what we're getting is these huge amounts of data with this massive computational infrastructure that is very quickly moving away from what a human can reasonably do on their own, just thinking about the patterns that they might be pulling from these. So by allowing computers to take some of the brunt of this thinking out of here, it gives us a lot more ability to work with some of this large data that we have. And this is already making its way into a lot of fields here. So medical diagnostics is a big one. Using patient data to try and predict diseases or assign treatments or things like that. Traffic control for city management. Security, especially cybersecurity, so detecting DDoS attacks and things like that. And then image analysis, just a very broad field, but it can be used for a lot of specific applications that we'll actually get into tomorrow when Ahmad talks about some of the image applications of this. And then banking is another large one where it's used to determine stock fluctuations and money movement and things like that. So some disadvantages of this, the models themselves tend to be non-interpretable. So when a model is built, it ends up being a black box where you have data, you put it in, and then you get a result out. So if you're looking, which can be very useful depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do prediction, that's very nice. But if you're trying to understand internal mechanisms of your data, so what might be causing changes within there, it's not going to be very good for that. It's more of a black box type of procedure. So you need to have a good understanding of what you intend to get out of it and what you want to do with it after. It can be susceptible to errors because there's not human interaction on this. It can tend to replicate and sort of go off on strange tangents if it's not taken care of properly, which is also important. You have to understand the method you're using and how it's going to work with your data and the parameters within that method that you can use to control it and get more sensible results, and also how to confirm that your results are in fact sensible. You need large training sets, and generally the more data you have, the better your resulting model is going to be. This is becoming less of a disadvantage as data is becoming more and more available. But if you're looking at a limited problem that has a limited set of data, then machine learning might not be highly applicable to that. And there's generally long computation times, which again, as we're moving forward to this higher infrastructure, faster and more computers, this is becoming less of a problem. So there are two main types of machine learning, denoted as supervised and unsupervised. And what these have to do each is with how the data is given to the machine. So in supervised learning, it is given labeled data. So it's given a set of data that it knows what the answer is, and then it builds a predictive model based on that. And then if you give it unlabeled data, it will make, or it will return you a prediction of what the response is for the given data. So an example of this is if you gave it a series of images with like cats or dogs, or letters of the alphabet, another common one, and you told it that all of these pictures are dog pictures, all of these pictures are cat pictures. Do your best with these images to try and predict what in these images caused it to be cat or dog. And then once it's built that model, if you give it another picture that is not labeled, it can predict whether it's a cat or dog based on that. And then unsupervised learning is when you just give it data that has no labeling on it, and it has to use inference to pull out what the distinctions within that data is. So in this case, if we use the same example, if you give it a series of images of cats or dogs, but you don't tell it which is which, then it would take the images and say, or it would find groups within the images that are roughly the same, and then you would take those results out and see how they match up. So if it was working how you wanted it to, then it would be able to separate the cat and dog images by the differences within those without actually knowing whether they were cats or dogs in the first place. Oh, come on. So we're going to talk about okay. So we'll talk about some supervised methods really quickly. The first one we'll go over is decision trees and random forests. And these are some of the most basic ones you can look at. A decision tree is a supervised learning method where it uses a series of pathways between initial data, and then it moves through a series of nodes to end up at what is referred to as a leaf or a given response. So an example here is a slightly morbid decision tree based on Titanic passenger survival rates. But as you move through each of these nodes, a question is asked, and then based on the answer to that question, you move one way or the other, and then you end up at your leafs, which are the likelihoods whether you survived or died in that incident here. And so these are built on supervised data, but then you can run unlabeled data through and end up at your leafs at the bottom and get an idea of what that data would be in this case. So the good thing about these is they're very easy to interpret and use. As you can see, pretty much anyone could read this and understand the pathways through it, and pretty much anyone could take their own data and apply it to this to get a result out from this. But these tend to be, since it's only a single decision tree, they tend to fluctuate heavily based on the data that is given to it. So that is when we go into random forests, which are it's called a random forest because it is a large number of decision trees. And what happens is it builds a series of trees, and then it pulls out random trees from there to run through and predict with this data. And then based on the number of results from each tree, it can get an idea of what the answer would be and how accurate it's going to be. And it's also useful for determining what variables are most important in predicting the result of your predicting the model by looking at how many trees have that given variable in it. And we'll look at an example of that later on. These are very nice because they're similar to decision trees, so the interpretability tends to be pretty good. They're very slow though, which is pretty good problem for this. And then we're going to look at one more really quickly, and these are support vector machines. So this is another supervised learning method. And the idea behind this is that it classifies and divides data into groups, and it does this using a hyperplane, which is it's a complicated way of an object that has one less dimension than the area it's in. So for example, in this case, we have a one-dimensional line cutting a two-dimensional plane. If we had a three-dimensional space, then we would need a two-dimensional plane to cut that. And then as you move up from there, then the dimensions get more complicated. But this still holds true. So by building this hyperplane, it defines different regions within your space of where the data is located. And this is optimized by running through and maximizing the distance between the points within each one of these groups and the lines separating them. So in this example here, we have these three lines, H1, H2, and H3. And H3 is selected as the best one because the distance between H3 and all the points in both groups is maximized compared to the other two. So if we jump over to R really quick, is that readable for everyone? Okay, let's get rid of these really quick. So there's a lot of packages in R that can do machine learning, things like that. We're going to be looking at some of the more basic ones. But we have the Caret, Tidyverse, Ranger, RPart, and there's also the random forest package, which I'll add on here. And then this E1071, which is a weird name. There's a longer story behind the name behind that, but it's I believe that one was built by statisticians, so the name might be a bit less imaginative. And the data we're going to be looking at for this is the Samsung Galaxy S3 data. And what this is it is data from Samsung Galaxy phones of the accelerometers within those phones that were operating during 6 different activities. So it's someone had a phone on them, and then they would walk, sit, climb stairs, things like that. And then this is all the data coming out from that. So if we look at these, we've got the unique ones. So we have 6 unique different activities that were going on: standing, sitting, laying, walking downstairs, and walking upstairs. And if we look at our data set over here, what we have is 7,352 observations of 563 variables. So from these cell phones, we were getting over 550 individual variables from the accelerometer. So it's a very large amount of data in this case, and it can tend to be confusing as to what columns we would use, because it would take a human a very long time to sort through that many columns and figure out which variables are significant to this and here. But we're able to do this very easily with machine learning. As this data set is in the repo, it needs some correction because RStudio changed how it, or the kinds of column names it can allow. So there's just some code to go through here and clean that up and change out any forbidden characters now. And then we're going to split our data into a training and testing set, which is one of the quintessential ways of assessing the validity of your model. So what we do is we take a training set and we build the data on that, and then we apply our testing set to it, and we see how the statistics of that come out. So if we run through and build this really quick. So now we have our 2 partitions. We have 80% training data and 20% testing data, and this create data partition, and the Caret package makes quick work of that. So if we start with the decision tree, we look at our part, it's recursive partitioning and regression trees. It's a function for building regression trees like this. And I've already gone through and made these models already because these tend to be very slow, and we don't want to be sitting around here for 5 minutes waiting for a random forest to finish running. But the general process of how you run these is very straightforward. So we're using our training data to build this model, and then we're trying to predict accuracy based on all of the given data from the accelerometers within these phones. And so we get this model object out, and we can take a look at that by plotting it, and then we'll add some text to it here. So if we look at that, because we know there are 6 activities, we expect there to be 6 leaves at the end because it's going to have 1 leaf for each activity here. And that's what we get out, which is nice. So if we start from the top, we can see that that variable t gravity acceleration min x, whatever that means, that appears to be the initial one to determine whether someone is laying down versus whether they're doing anything else. And then we can keep moving through that to see where we end up based on this. So from those 562 variables, it has selected these 5 here as the most significant ones and actually predicting what activity ends up occurring during this. And you can actually see these predictions are very good in this case. So these down here indicate the number of correct predictions and then the number of mispredictions. In this case, of all 1,126 laying predictions, they all follow this rule that that t gravity acceleration min variable is less than that number. It will all be those. We can see in some of the other ones we're getting some missed classifications here, but we can improve that as we move forward with some of the learning methods. And then if we look at how this is actually built as it moves forward, we can see that as we add on the number of splits in the trees, our overall error for this model decreases. So we start with no splits and add them on, and we get this nice curve down. So it's pretty clear we're not overfitting anything because this is moving down nice and smoothly. So then if we move on to a random forest model, there are 2 ways to do this. I think the most popular one is the random forest package in R. There's also a package called Ranger, which does random forest much more quickly than the random forest package. So I would recommend looking into that one. I found this a bit harder to visualize than the random forest, so I probably need to put more time into that. But I ended up using the random forest. They end up doing roughly the same thing, but it's just a matter of speed at that point because these can take a very long time to run. So in this case, you can see we're using the exact same setup. We're predicting activity as a function of all the other variables, and we're using the training data again. We're doing 200 trees in this case just to speed up some of the algorithm. If you were actually running this to get a more meaningful result, you would want to increase this up to something like 1,000. But we have this model out, and if we take a look at this, there are 2 ways we can visualize this. So if we zoom in on this, then this is the error we get based on the number of trees it runs through. So you can see when we start with a small number of trees, we have much higher error. As we start adding on and increasing the trees available in our random forest, the error decreases significantly, and then it plateaus out at the end. So based on this, this is actually 500 trees. The model is loaded up here, but this seems to be a pretty good number. It appears to be converging quite nicely in that case. And then if we look at the printout here, this is a very useful way of understanding what's going on in these. But you can see we have predictions on one axis and actual responses on the other. So across the diagonal, those indicate values that when laying down was predicted, when the person was actually laying down for that. So most of the data should lie along the diagonal if these were, or if our model is good, and that is pretty clearly the case. So this does have a very good accuracy moving forward. We can see a couple of issues in here. So if you look at these standing and sitting, those tend to be difficult to distinguish in some cases, at least compared to the other ones. Laying is certainly the easiest one to predict. And then walking up, down, and straight are also a bit better, but we can see standing and sitting definitely has a bit of convolution going on between those two. From this random forest, we can also take a look at what the important variables are for our prediction accuracy of this model. So there's this important function we can run through. And then if we plot this, so what I'm doing now is I've identified that this t-gravity acceleration min is the most important variable in this case, which you'll actually remember from being on the previous decision tree as the highest one up. So if we actually plot this and take a look at what this variable is, One sec, let's see here. Oh, let's do. Let's see. Seems like it's not actually finding that one within the training data. It's a bit odd. Oh, it looks like the old symbols are still in there. So let me run through it one more time up here. Those. There we go. So if you're wondering what actually makes a variable important in prediction, if we look at this here, we have our 6 activities here, and then this is this important variable down at the bottom. So you can see that this variable is very useful for actually selecting what activity might be going on, because all of the laying down data is way over on that side, below 0 roughly, and then everything else is on the other side. So just by knowing this variable here, I can very strongly know whether we are laying down or if we're doing something else. And so that's how this sort of works. It'll split off the predictions one at a time. In this case, from here, it'll check to see whether we're laying down or doing anything else. And then from there, it can keep moving down and splitting off activities as it goes down. So this is consistent with what a useful variable would look like. And then the support vector machines, because this is a bit of a higher dimensionality, these are difficult to visualize here, but we can build it in the same way. You can see it's the same as before. The activity is a function of all the other variables of the training data. And so we can look at a summary of our model down here. And it gives us some information about the classes here and where it's split up. So now if we actually do a comparison on all of these models with the testing data, which is how we can determine what the useful accuracy of this is, if we just predict all of these and then run these through. Oops. So we predict 3 ones. It's having trouble with some of the variables. Let me run through this again. There we go. And then if we look at our results here, so this is percent accuracy of the testing data based on these given models. So we can see from our regression tree, we get an 89% accuracy with the testing data, which is pretty okay. But then if we look at the other two, the random forest is 99.6% accurate, and the support vector machine is 99.0 accurate for these cases. So by stepping up the complexity of these models a little bit, we get much, much better predictive accuracies for this. So this sort of gives you an idea of some of the applications of this, because this suggests that just given the data from your phone, the accelerometer from your phone, we can predict with over 99% accuracy what activity you are currently doing as you have it. So this is this is some of the advantages of machine learning and the kinds of results you can pull out of these. So if we go back to the slides a little bit, then we're going to jump over and take a look at unsupervised learning methods. So if we recall from before, a supervised method is one where we are given labeled data and then we have to pull results out from that. In this case, we gave the machine data that was already labeled with what activity was being done, and then it built a model from that. And when we gave it unlabeled data, it was able to tell us what activity came out of that with a very high percentage of accuracy. But if we don't have labeled data in the first place, then we have to use unsupervised learning. So most unsupervised learning falls into clustering, and there's a couple different kinds. I'm going to focus on centroid and hierarchical clustering in these cases. So the first one to talk about is hierarchical clustering, and this is generally clustering is a way of finding groups of similar data within an entire set, and it defines these as clusters of data that are similar. So in the cases of hierarchical clustering, it starts from all the data just existing as unique data points, and then it moves up and it draws connections between those data points as it goes forward. And the higher up it goes, the wider range of connections occur. So if we look at this dendrogram here, which is a result of something like this, these are all our individual data points. And as we start to move up, they connect with the data around them. And then we can see, so these two data points are close to each other, and then they form a cluster here. And then these two groups form a cluster here, here, and so on, and it moves up here. So hierarchical clustering is a way of performing clustering without actually specifying how many clusters exist within the data. And once you get your results out, then what you want to look for is groups that are separated by a good amount of height between them. So we can see from the top, this entire side is one group, and then this entire side is another group, and we can move down a bit and we see subgroups from there. So it is up to the, from this dendrogram, you then have to determine where you want your cutoff to be within these groups and what similarities you're looking for in between them. So in this case, they make the cut at about 5 height, which gives them the 4 clusters here. You can move up to go down to 2. If you start moving down, then you see the clusters have less vertical distance from each other, which means they are less isolated from one another, which suggests that they might not be true clusters. And then if we look at centroid clustering, this is another type of clustering where you actually have to have some understanding of how many clusters you're going to observe within your data. So in this case here, we have specified that there are 2 centroids within this data. And what it will do is it assigns random centroids, and it measures the position of the data from each one, and it keeps moving those around to optimize minimizing the distance between a centroid and all the data around it. So in this case, these 2 centroids have ended up at locations where all the data in their respective groups is minimized or has a minimum distance to that centroid itself. So it's a good way of looking at separations within your data. And then with unsupervised learning, when you have these groups assigned, it is then up to the individual researcher to look at what the distinctions between those groups might be, or what causes them to be different in some case, because the machine learning won't necessarily tell you why they're different. It will just say that this group is similar and this group is similar. They are not similar to each other, or something like that. So if we look at an example, oops, there. We're going to jump back to R, and we're going to use the iris data set for this one because it's a bit easier to visualize. This is a very popular data set. I'm sure it's popped up in some of the previous ones. But we're using 2 packages. The then extend the color space ones are just useful for visualizing dendrograms and the subsets of this one. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the iris data set and the relationship between the length of the petals and the width of the petals for all of these. So let's run through this really quick. There we go. So if we zoom in on this, and It's a bit hard to see the letters, but what's important here is the colors. We can see that if we're looking at the relationship between petal length and petal width for all of these, then the tree is what results from this. So we can see here, we have our individual data points, and then as we move up, it starts to expand these clusters a little bit. And what we see is a very strong split in the height right here around the middle. And we know from this data set that there are 3 distinct species in here. So it makes sense that we would see 3 groups like this, but these are quite clearly distinct. And this group down here is more distinct than the other 2 up here. So within this group, we have nearly all of the red. One thing, I can't quite read that from this angle. And then we have the green and blue. So the blue is totally unique with itself, and then the red is mostly unique. But what we can see is that the green one is actually sort of diffusing between the 2, which means that data points that are actually from the green species end up being collected within the red cluster. And we don't know that until we actually assign the species to each of these as we move forward. So if we didn't know the species, then all we would get is just the dendrogram with none of the colors on it, but we could still see that there are either 2 or 3 pretty clear distinctions between this group. And then if we, if we go into centroid, oh, here it is. So here's a quick visualization of what we're actually clustering here. It should be a bit up higher, we have petal length and petal width, and then we have our 3 species here. So this makes sense. We have a red one down, and I think the colors got flipped around moving forward, but the one down in the lower corner is very clearly the blue one in the previous one that had almost no overlap. And then we can see that the other 2 groups that are defined here have some interaction going on in the middle where they're not very clearly defined. And so that's where the blending occurred between the clusters in the dendrogram. So then we're going to do centroid clustering on these. So seed for that. And then this is a k-means function is available in the base one. We have to actually specify the number of clusters in this one. So because we know there are 3 species within this data set, we're going to say find 3 clusters within here. And then this end start is it's just a parameter. It's the number of random centroids used to start with this. It defaults to 1, but for most data sets, you're going to want to bump that up to speed things up and get more stable results here. So I think I ran this. And if we look at the result from this, then we can see where it's clustered these. So it's assigned clusters 1, 2, and 3 to each of these data points that so far have nothing to do with the species until we actually observe how those distributions ended up working out. And then we can also look at the positions of these centroids. So if we do some plotting here, we get the, first we assign the cluster groups to the data set, and then we get the positional information for the centers here. And we can take a look at this. So here what we have is these black points are the centers of each of the given groups, and then the color is which cluster they're in, and the shape is what species they actually end up being. So we can see the diamonds is all consistent with each other, but if you look between the blue and the green, there's a bit of mismatch between the color and shape. So that is the area where we're seeing blending between our 2 species, where the different species might end up in the same cluster with each other. And this makes sense given that they're running into each other as they move forward, essentially. But most of them are pretty accurate in the groups they end up selecting. So that was a rough overview and some of the basic functions and operations you can do with machine learning. Machine learning is a massive field, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it, and there's a lot of different parameters and resources you can use for this. So it really heavily depends on what data you have and what you plan on doing with it, what model you end up using, and what kind of resources you might need for that. And I wanted to close out with a bit of a, let's get you back over there, some of the more interesting results of machine learning processes recently. So this is a computer that was actually programmed to write jokes. It was given the format, I like my X, like I like my Y, Z, and then it used machine learning to come up with jokes on that based on relationships between words in there. So some of them, I like my relationships, like I like my source open, I like my coffee, like I like my war cold, things like that. So it was able to find that this word cold had these had this connection between the words coffee and war, and it was able to produce a joke from that, which I think is pretty entertaining. And then if we go back to images, if we zoom in on this, image processing is probably one of the more complicated areas of machine learning, but you can sort of see where some of the hiccups come into and the kinds of things that might make it very difficult. In this case, we have a mix of dogs or food, and it was a machine learning algorithm's goal to distinguish these, which it could not do very well. So as weird as it seems, things like this sort of pattern recognition is very deeply ingrained into the basic operations of our human brains work. And so if a human might look at a picture and it might be the most obvious thing, but then a computer could look at it and have absolutely no idea what's going on. So it's a bit weird. Sometimes the things that might seem very simple end up being complicated. But if you back up and squint, I could definitely see this being difficult, especially the Labradoodle and fried chicken one, I think. And then this is probably my favorite one, but there's some neat stuff going on where they're actually training programs to teach itself how to walk. So here's an example of the optimization of some of these. So you can see when it starts out with the first generation, it's pretty terrible. It just falls over immediately. But as it runs and it continues these iterations, it progressively learns a little bit more and more each time about how to actually stand up properly. So you can see over time, it ends up figuring out a process to move correctly. And these were not, the only thing that was given to these was just the physics of how the body is designed and how it moves, and the general goal to walk forward. The entire, all the movement you see here was totally developed by the machine. So you can see it gets a bit weird in some points. And there's another one on there, the Google DeepMind or something like that, which ends up, it figured out that the best way for it to walk was with its hands above its head, which looks very humorous as it's running through the obstacle field, getting boxes thrown at it and things like that. So this is all the, it's a little bit wacky, definitely, as far as an entire field of research, but it definitely has its uses moving forward. So I think that's what I have for now. Are there any questions overall? Yes?
So for this, would they like apply it to, so like a huge thing is like pterosaurs, we don't really have fossils. Well, we have fossils, but we have like a piece of the wing. We don't have the whole body.
Right.
So would we be able to adapt something like this on what we think, like the size of the wing compared to the size of the body, and then have to just figure out how it actually moves?
So the question overall is that if we find a fossil of some dinosaur, if we can reconstruct the physiological aspects of that dinosaur, then we could just train it and see how it actually moved.
Yeah.
Sure, that definitely seems like something that's possible. And it's, I mean, they've gone through a number of iterations to how we actually think dinosaurs walked around. Like it used to be the Tyrannosaurus standing up straight, dragging the tail around and things like that. So there is a bit of physics that goes into understanding that, and you could probably use some of that to direct this a little bit. But you can, when you look at especially the bipedal ones with the tail, it seemed to move very naturally moving forward, just as on its own learning. So yeah, that would certainly be something that's very possible for that.
There's a huge issue with this one, where it's like 15 feet high, and its head is like as big as its body.
Okay.
And they have no idea how it moved because it just doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah. In that case, the only thing I could think was that you would need a pretty good fossil record to actually be able to build a working replica of the motor physics of whatever that creature happened to be. But yeah, that definitely seems quite possible. And it's getting more extreme in this case. This poor man is about to have a 3-kilogram object thrown at him, and he'll have to correct for that as it moves forward. But yeah, that's an interesting, and you can see machine learning can sort of move into even paleontology and things like that. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.